Good evening, and thank you all for joining us at this panel discussion of The Donut King by Alice Gu. My name is David Bland, and I'm on the Film Selection Committee of the Teaneck International Film Festival, and I'll be moderating this talkback. The Donut King will premiere on PBS on Monday, May 24th. For those of you in the New York, New Jersey area, that would be WNET Channel 13. And the version that PBS will show is a little bit longer than the one we saw tonight. I have to tell you that I was personally very excited when I heard we were going to show this documentary because I grew up in Los Angeles, and though I moved east in 1979, I've gone back and forth dozens of times since then, and I well remember Winchell's Donuts and noticed their gradual disappearance and replacement by donut shops that were run by what I would later learn were Cambodian refugee families. And I'd often join my father at his favorite donut shop located at San Vicente and Olympic in Los Angeles, and also run by a Cambodian family. But tonight's film is far more than simply a tale about the donut business, and it's more than a story about one man's rise and fall. It's a timeless story central to America's mythology about itself. It's about an America that welcomed the old world's tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and about our iconic Lady Liberty sitting not far from where I sit in New York Harbor, who lifts her lamp beside America's golden door. The Teaneck Film Festival is thrilled to welcome 4 panelists to our talkback tonight. Adam Vaughn is the owner of DK's Donuts of Orange and the Donut Parlor, and we saw him in tonight's film. Adam's parents were sponsored by Ted Ngoy in their journey to the United States, and now, 3 decades later, Adam has taken over his parents' donut stores. Karen Monken is director of pre-arrival and initial resettlement for HIAS, H-I-A-S, which may ring a bell with many of you, as it was founded in 1881 as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. HIAS today works with all nationalities and is one of the 9 agencies contracted by the State Department to provide services to refugees for their first 90 days after arrival. Snehal Batra is an attorney specializing in US and Canadian immigration and nationality law. She's managing attorney of the Raritan, New Jersey office of Nachman, Fulwani, and Zimochvek Law Group. Ayda Zugay, herself a refugee from the former Yugoslavia, has worked with Refugees International and is currently the principal and co-founder of Advancing Agency, a consulting collective that supports equity-driven changemakers on their journey towards sustainable impact. And she's spent the bulk of her 2-decade career advancing human rights, equity, and justice, as well as driving successful policy agendas of major institutions. For our audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat window. I can't promise to get to all of them, but I'll do my best in our limited time. So I welcome our panelists, and I'd like to begin with Adam Vaughn. Adam, would you tell us how your parents came to America and got into the donut business?
Well, as you guys saw in the film, Uncle Ted migrated here in 1975, and he, as one of his first jobs, he learned how to make donuts. In 1980, my parents, the Khmer Rouge had fallen a year prior to that. And, you know, Uncle Ted made tremendous efforts to bring a lot of his families out of Cambodia and into the States. And one of those families was my mom, my dad, my brother, my sisters. When they got here, Uncle Ted taught everything he knew about the donut business. And in 1984, my parents were able to open up their own donut shop, which is the ultimate goal, coming to the United States, just living the American dream. 3 years after that, they were able to buy their own home. And yeah, that's the story.
And did they work for Ted Ngoy first? Is that how they built up their?
I believe so. Yeah, like 1981, they were renting one of the shops from Uncle Ted. I believe in the city of Corona, I believe. Yeah.
Hmm. And did they speak English when they got here?
No, no, that is a one of the setbacks and hardships that they dealt with being business owners in America. I mean, now that I've taken over the family business, it's I know how difficult it is, but I just can't imagine going to a foreign country and trying to run a business. And that was pretty hard for my parents, but they had my brother, my sister, and I to help them be translator. But I asked my mom, was she intimidated? Was she scared about running a business and not knowing how to speak English very well? And she told me something very valuable. She said, smiling goes a long way. So she just, smiled, was super friendly, and that's all she needed to, provide for her family.
Now, how many hours a day would you say your family worked in the donut store?
Oh, oh, it's a marathon. Running a donut shop, especially here in California, I don't know how it is out of California, but it's 24 hours a day. And it's essentially 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It doesn't stop. No vacation times. My parents they didn't take a vacation for at least the first 15 years until my brother and sister and I were able to run the shop by ourselves. And one of the first vacations they took was back to Cambodia, I believe in like 1995, I believe. Yeah.
And they've since moved back there part of the time, right?
Yeah, yeah. My parents, well deserved, are retired now. They and I tell my parents this every day because I feel super blessed that I could buy them a home, I could buy them the nicest car, but I am in debt to them for the rest of my life because they made tremendous sacrifices. And yeah, they just spend most of their time in Cambodia. They bought a big plot of land, 10 acres, and they're farming. My mom just told me she bought 200 chickens last week, and she's just living the life she had prior to the war.
Do you know, did they lose a lot of family to the Khmer Rouge?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I know my mom lost her mother.
Mm.
Um, my father lost some siblings as well. He doesn't speak of it as much as my mom, but yeah, there was a lot of loss during that time for them.
And how old were you? You have a brother and a sister. I can't remember now, but how old
Yeah.
were you siblings when you started working in the donut stores?
Uh, well, the shop that I run now, and we're going on year 37, so it's almost 4 decades. My parents bought that shop in 1984, and I was born in 1985. So I assume I started working there from day one. They just started teaching me. I think my first words were donut. So they were already training me. So yeah, it was a group effort. Everybody had to contribute to the family business, and it's something I take a lot of pride in carrying on forever and possibly pass it on to my own kids.
We'll come back to, thank you, Adam. I'd like to turn now to Karen Monken. Karen works for HIAS. Karen, would you tell us what you do there and what HIAS does?
Absolutely. So HIAS is the largest Jewish resettlement or refugee resettlement agency in the world. As you said, we started in the late 1800s to provide aid to Hebrew immigrants, but now we actually serve all different ethnicities and nationalities and have done for several decades. We are one of the 9 resettlement agencies that has the contract from the State Department to provide services to people who initially resettled to the United States. But we also have other programs through the Department of Health and Human Services and private funders to help support refugees after 90 days, because of course, that's a very small amount of time. Resettlement now looks a little bit different than it did in 1980, actually because of the Refugee Act of 1980 that was established then. And it really created the refugee resettlement program and kind of professionalized the services that newcomers would receive. and set a definition of a refugee based on the one from the United Nations. And so now we have this contract to provide services for 90 days. People come to the United States, and we get them set up with avenues to ESL, to employment services. We enroll the children in school. We make sure that they have food and housing and material needs to have a successful start in America. And there is still involvement from community groups at varying levels of support. It's definitely needed. It's a public-private partnership. But it's not in the sense that somebody can sponsor someone to come to the United States anymore, at least not right now. There is some interest in private sponsorship starting again, but at the moment that doesn't really exist. And so we really work with community members through co-sponsorship groups that might do mentoring, might come alongside a refugee family and provide material goods, set up apartments, help connect them to employment services.
What are the major nationalities of people that you work with?
Yeah, so the nationalities have changed over the years with successive waves of migration. Obviously, in the 1980s, primarily people came from East Asia, and now, in the 1990s, the former Soviet Union. In the 2000s, it's been more from the Near East or South Asia. So not only people from Syria or Iraq, but people from Bhutan, and also quite a few different populations from Africa. So people from the Congo or Somalia. It's interesting because, in 1980, there were actually over 200,000 refugees that came in that year. And in the movie, I found it so fascinating that they said Camp Pendleton had 24 hours to set up for 18,000 refugees, because that was the actual ceiling for refugees last year, was 18,000 refugees. And they had 24 hours to bring people in, obviously take more time to get them connected to families and sponsors and, employment and services. But it really just shows our capacity as a nation to welcome the stranger and to bring people in to safety. And so we're really excited, that the resettlement program is building back, and that, we're starting to see larger capacity that's being built again for people to come and come to America in safety.
You mentioned you work with private organizations also to help people. So, can you give us some examples of who those private organizations are?
Sure. So actually, we have a partnership with Airbnb, and they provide some temporary housing when people arrive if we can't find a place fast enough for them to stay. We also work with the Church of Latter-day Saints, and they provide material goods and some cash assistance. And there are quite a few other organizations. We're one of the partners of the Tent Foundation, which is a foundation that was started by the founder of Chobani. And there are quite a few different organizations under that umbrella that are helping refugees to become self-sufficient in the United States.
Before we leave you, I just have to mention as an aside, I know we have a number of avid theater goers watching. And I would like to mention that the Astor Library in the East Village, which is now home to the Public Theater, was a HIAS resettlement center beginning in the 1920s and lasted about 40 years before being sold to Joe Papp. So I know that will be of great interest to some people in our audience and of no interest to others, but I had to mention it. I'd like to turn to Snehal Batra now. Now, you're an attorney specializing in immigration law. And can you first tell us what is the difference between a refugee, an immigrant, and an asylum seeker?
Sure, David. That's a great question. Actually, the major difference is the location. Refugees and political asylees, they both have to be classified as a refugee, as Karen mentioned. And so the definition of refugee is that an individual cannot return to their home country or unwilling to return to their home country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, political opinion, nationality. So if you meet this definition of refugee, it depends on where you are. So if you're outside the US, then you have to go through the refugee resettlement process. Agencies such as Karen, they would assist in resettling the individual into the US. Whereas for asylum, the individual is already in the US, either legally or illegally out of status, or at the port of entry or border. So they're making a claim for asylum while they're in the US, and they have 1 year to make that claim. That's the major difference.
So when you say they can't go back, you mean never?
Well, when you are applying for asylum, the understanding is you cannot go back, unwilling to go back because you fear persecution. So you cannot go back to your home country until eventually you become a citizen.
Mhm.
So generally what happens is once you're granted asylum, that means the US government, immigration, they're not going to send you back to your home country. And you have that status for 1 year. And then after that, you're eligible to apply for a green card.
I see.
And with the green card, it's not advisable that you travel back to your home country. And it's only recommended when you become a US citizen, which you can do after 5 years.
I know a lot of people come to the US and work on, I think they're called H-1B visas. And what is the
right.
difference between that and a green card?
Okay, so an H-1B visa is a temporary non-immigrant work visa. So that is when you have a US employer that wants to hire a foreign national to work in a specialty occupation. These individuals are professionals, and so they're able to get sponsorship to work temporarily in the US. And the green card is more permanent. That is when the employer or even family members can sponsor you for a green card for long-term permanent residence in the US.
Now, how has immigration law changed since when the Cambodian refugees came, in the 1980s, and even before? What kind of changes have there been?
Well, interestingly, the last major immigration reform was in 1986. And so since then, there really has not been comprehensive immigration reform. There has been a lot of policy changes, trying to shape the law through executive orders, through, as we've seen over the last couple of years, but there has not really been comprehensive immigration reform. And so a lot of people say, our system is broken. It just isn't there. It's a question of supply and demand. Like there is not enough visas or green cards available, and it's creating a backlog, in so many different categories. And so you have a huge section of the population, like the H-1B visa holder, that are waiting decades to become permanent residents because of our quota system. So, and those quota systems were created in the 50s. And so they really don't accurately, depict the demands of the country, the employment and family-based system.
What was the change in 1986 that you alluded to?
So that was under IRA, the Immigration Reform Act. And the biggest change from that really was this creation of the I-9 form, which is to verify an individual's legal ability to work in the US. That was a major one. It also created some penalties that if you were out of status, you could pay a penalty and adjust your status in the US. And so those were some major ones. And since then, really, we've been waiting. The last, I would say, sunset of some kind of amnesty expired in April of 2001. And I actually remember I was in law school at the time, and we had to file a whole bunch of hundreds of cases before this deadline because it was to preserve the individual's ability to eventually become legal. So that was in 2001, and we're still waiting for comprehensive reform.
And one last question before we move on, would you explain this concept of family sponsorship? I'm not even sure I have the term right, versus what it used to be, where we had national quota. Yeah.
So the US immigration system, they have a family preference classification and immediate relative. So As a US citizen, you're able to immediately sponsor your spouse, your parents, and your children under 21. They don't go into the preference category, okay? But then you have the preference category, which means that based on your status as a citizen or a green card holder, you're able to petition for other relatives, you know, and that's, we heard the derogatory term of, you know, chain immigration, but what, you know, what the preference system, how that works is that you're able to sponsor your adult children, because once you age out over 21, you no longer can petition for them unless they fall into this preference system. So children over 21, married children, and most importantly, also siblings. You're able to petition for siblings. So there is a classification, and also there are set quota numbers and per country cap. So for example, the Immigration Service will not allow more than 7% of green cards or approvals to a particular country. So that creates huge backlogs for countries like China and India.
I see. I see. Thank you. We'll turn now to Ayda Zugay. Ayda is herself a refugee and works with refugees. And so Ayda, can you tell us a little bit actually about your own story first, if you don't mind, and then we'll talk about your work. But you have a very compelling personal story, I know. How old were you when you came to the US?
Sure. I actually was a young activist in my country, and I came here with my sister when I was 12 years old. It was just the two of us. And
no, your parents were not with you?
No, it was just her and I. We crossed the border, I got on a plane, got to the United States. And there was actually a couple of women on the plane, ironically both named Tracy, who we didn't know at the time. I didn't speak any English. And my sister and I were seated, we were supposed to sit next to each other, but we ended up having to be seated separately because there was a woman with a daughter that wanted to sit next to each other. So we made way for them. And I didn't speak any English, but all I know is we kind of mimed, and I helped them learn how to crochet something that they were working on. And, you know, right before we were about to leave the plane, they gave us an envelope and told us not to open it until we leave. And inside was $100 bill, and it had a really beautiful message on the envelope. You know, I'm actually still searching for them. Because, you know, they were our first introduction to the United States. So if Tracy and Tracy are listening to this and this sounds familiar, hello. I actually reinvigorate my search every Thanksgiving and Memorial Day, because those are the times when I think of them the most, because that $100 actually lasted us that entire summer for food. You know, we obviously didn't have any money. In fact, we were only able to cross the border because a band on the minibus actually gave us money to help cross the border. So there were just a series of good Samaritans that got us to come here. And then we stayed with a host family for a year in Iowa. And then
Iowa?
Yeah, in Iowa, in the Midwest, in a small town called Lone Rock, famous for a rock about the height of, about a 6-foot rock. It was really interesting experience there. And then I moved over to New York when my parents came. We actually just closed our eyes. My dad took out a pen, pointed on the map, and it was New York. So that's where we went. We lived there for some time. I actually, the first thing that I did was get a job, cleaning homes. And, Karen, unfortunately, at the time, there wasn't such a great support for refugees. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. And so we were homeless for some time until we were able to find a home. And in the movie, as you might hear, they talked about how they had to travel back and forth to go to a toilet, to find a toilet. And that really resonated because we actually didn't have a bathroom. So it was one of those, I wonder if that's a common experience. So ended up going to high school in New York and was fortunate to get a scholarship to go to college. I went to BU, and ever since was really committed to working with refugees. And I went to Zambia to start a refugee program and came back and started in the nonprofit space. So it's been an interesting, wonderful experience to be here. So
that is it's a wonderful story. Now, I know you've worked with an organization called Refugees International, and you've done other work with refugees. Can you just tell us a bit about the kind of stuff you've done in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting. It's a very weird calling that came to me when I had just come as a refugee to the US and haven't yet sorted my own things. But I felt this deep need to realize that there were other people who were dealing with the same things at the time when I was safe. So when I was unsafe, I wondered who was bearing witness. And so here I was now safe in the United States, bearing witness to the crimes that were happening with other refugees. I felt compelled to do something about it. And so even now when I look at the TV, there's so many different situations that evoke that emotion and reality. And so I started a program in Maheba refugee camp in Zambia, which is in Central Africa. And it was a refugee-led initiative to inform refugees of the rights they hold under the UN Geneva Convention, which helped us address previously unaddressed human rights violations, which was a really important thing. As many of the folks on this panel may know, refugees sometimes can be a place of anarchy, refugee camps. And so it's very important to have some type of law and order. And then, and I also did refugee work through my time working at different nonprofits, all of whom worked with refugees, particularly the Central American population and unaccompanied minors, both young women and young men who were coming from different parts of Central America. And then I also engaged with Refugees International, who is working both in the US and across the world. And they have this amazing thing called the Refugee Advocacy Lab, where they engage different refugees to talk about different policies and really grow refugee presence in conversations around policies that affect refugees. And they are also working with the International Rescue Committee and the Refugee Congress. It's a collaboration effort, which is always great. That's a brief history of that.
Now, someone in the audience asked this question of you, Ayda. When you said cross the border, what did you mean by that? Since you were in that story, you were on a plane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So essentially, one of the things that was difficult at the time, I remember in the movie they talked about how, the last plane out was a military plane. And so it's a similar situation, the last plane out was, across the border. And so we had to cross the border from former Yugoslavia into Hungary, where we were able to, where we actually ended up getting visas to fly out to the United States. And so echoing kind of what Snehal had mentioned earlier, we actually went to United States. We were asylum seekers. And then once we proved that we were refugees, which is a very extensive process for people to go through. There's a lot of things that you have to prove to gain refugee status, that you're persecuted for your race, ethnicity, religion, and other factors that make you a persecuted person. And then I became a refugee in the United States. And so that's also where an interesting question comes with the gap of services that Karen, I'm sure, is very familiar with. When asylum seekers at that time actually had no support or services. So imagine coming to a country, not speaking a language, not having a place to live, not having any income, not being able to work. And so it's interesting for sure to think about.
Yeah, when we spoke earlier, Ayda, you mentioned that this was one of the big differences between an immigrant and a refugee. And I wonder if you could just share that with the audience, in terms of how they end up here and You know what I'm referring to, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah. I mean, I think immigrants and refugees ultimately, and asylum seekers and all other folks who are coming to a different country, share many things in common. People that come here will face discrimination, will have difficulty adjusting, will have to face some identity crises when they come here and be asked to abandon their culture in order to assimilate. So there are many things that people have in common. One thing that I think is really critical to think about too is the difference between immigrants and refugees is that immigrants choose to come to the United States. It's their chosen country. Refugees are forced to leave their country. And so that's a really important thing. Another thing is immigrants are able to make a plan to move to that country. So people save money, people learn the language of the country they want to move to. People are able to think about how to understand laws to bring their family as well. They're often have skills that are highly educated, so they're able to assimilate better into a country and perhaps face less discrimination. That's only perhaps, of course, whereas refugees have no notice. I knew I was leaving the day before I left. Literally just the night before I left. And so there's no notice. You often won't speak the language. I spoke zero English. You will not have a plan to go anywhere. You will pack the last things you have. I have almost nothing from my country, and the things I do are cherished. And so those are, I think, really big differences.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience for Snehal. Can you talk a little bit about Daca and help for our Mexican immigrants and, I guess, asylum seekers?
Right. I mean, that's a little bit outside the scope of, what we're discussing, but sure, DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. It was a program that was started by the Obama administration. And then, of course, when the Trump administration took office, they took it offline. It was challenged, but DACA is back online. So if you have no status or came into the US as a child, a baby, went to high school here, if we can prove that you had some education and that you don't have any other issues with the police, any convictions, arrests, anything like that, then what DACA does, it allows you to be placed in deferred action status. That means that the government, the US government, cannot deport you, but it also doesn't give you legal status. It's like this in between. It allows you to work and to remain here, and you can extend that as long as the program is still valid. And right now DACA is available. So if people never applied before, should apply, absolutely. There is stuff happening in Congress, obviously, for the dreamers that potentially could make DACA permanent. Under the Biden Immigration Act, there is a piece of law in there that says the individuals that have DACA status would immediately get permanent resident status. So, but of course, that's all, these are all proposals right now. We don't know what and when it will pass.
We have a question from the audience for Karen Monken and others also. Can you address the current refugee immigrant situation? And I would like to add to that, if you could talk a little bit about how the Refugee Resettlement Act fits into all of this.
The Refugee Act of 1980.
Yes, that's what I'm, yes, yeah.
Yeah, so it's very specific to people that are coming as refugees from overseas. And so there's an extensive vetting process that happens for people who are coming under this act and through this particular program called the Reception and Placement Program that I manage at HIAS and is also in the other agencies. And so it can take, years for people to go through these processes. There's security checks, there's health screenings, there's family tree interviews, and a lot of steps to go through, and less than 1% of all the people who are noted as needing resettlement from the UN actually make it to resettlement to a third country, and that's any third country, US, Canada, etc. So what the act did is it did establish the ability for the president to set a ceiling for refugees each year. And that's what I was alluding to when saying that last year was 18,000. This year started at 15,000, but under the new administration has been increased to a ceiling of 62,500. That does not mean that 62,000 people will be able to come, even though there is need and there are families that are waiting for them. And it does mean that we have the ability to start building the program back up, because the government will consider these things, a goal. And so if the ceiling is 18,000, that doesn't mean 18,000 people come. Last year, I think it was 11,500 approximately. And so it really, you have people that have spent years in the system overseas, trying to come join their relatives, trying to get to safety. And because of these sort of arbitrary numbers, have not been able to, and things are expiring. And so there's a lot of pieces that need to be sort of put back into the puzzle for it to happen. But we're really excited about that and hoping that things are going to start turning around pretty soon.
Snehal, I saw you shaking your head. Did you want to add something to that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, we're excited because Biden has pledged that he's going to, not only did he increase it this year, but that the next fiscal year, he's talking about increasing it to like 150,000. So that would be tremendous. So that's really the only thing. Yeah.
I had a feeling someone would ask about this, and I want to show everyone a graph of what those ceilings have been since 1980. See, this is the, since 1980, these are the annual ceiling and number of admitted refugees. And you can see in 1980, it was way up, dropped down, went up a little bit more, and then it's on a pretty steady slope down. And this is where it's at most recently. So you can see it's gigantic changes in the last few years, and not changes for the better, I would say.
And I think you can see from the film and also from that graph that it has historically been a bipartisan program.
Yeah.
And really has had support from both sides of the government. And so we're hoping that will come back into being.
Yeah, it does seem to me that when that started in 1980, that the U.S. Felt some responsibility to these people, and that we've lost that almost completely in the last few years. Now, something that all of you brought up when I spoke to you before, and that was, I should, when I say all, actually, Snehal, Ayda, and Adam brought it up, and that was how you feel about America as immigrants. Now, my grandparents, who were immigrants, were, as my mother used to like to say, more American than Americans. And I was really struck in talking to you guys about the way you look at America and the opportunities that you've gotten here. So I'd like to go through one by one and just talk about that a little bit. Adam, if you don't mind, we could start with you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm first generation. I believe I'm the first generation immigrant. And it's not lost on me that what my parents went through, all that pain and suffering, and that's the reason why I take so much pride in running the business, because I feel like the donut business is tied to that history. So every day when I go into work, it reminds me every day the struggles they had to go through. And, sometimes if you're a third or fourth generation, you kind of forget where your ancestor comes from and all the bad stuff they had to go through. But I don't have to go through that because it's recent history in my mind. And I'm going to do what I can do moving forward to make sure my kids and their kids know the history and what our family had to go through to appreciate what we have and the opportunities that we have in America.
Sorry, I was muted. Ayda, go ahead. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to really think about, particularly at this stage in America. Looking at the racial reckoning that this country is facing, looking at um, the discrimination that's happening across the country with our sisters and brothers, looking at all of the different issues that this country has. It could be very easy to ignore the great parts of what this country has to offer. One of the things that I will never lose sight of as a refugee and an immigrant to this country is that looking at the world perspective, America is by far the country where I would want to be out of all countries that I've visited and been. And the reason why is because I can never lose that perspective of living in a dictatorship with being persecuted for what I say or what I do, and being able to be killed for that. And so living in a country that's able to afford me something different is absolutely incredible. When I look at the Freedom Index, that the Freedom House Index that came out for in rated different countries, I was very surprised to see United States as listed as 83. Croatia, my former home, was listed as 85. Slovenia, my former home, also was listed as 95. A 95, so higher to closer to 100 is better. And what I found interesting is I was reading through different comments that folks had written, and Mongolia was 84, which is one higher than United States. South Africa was 79, very near. Cape Verde was 92, and Chile was 93 at a time when everybody was protesting against the government. And I found it interesting. I texted all of my friends and colleagues who have come from all of these different countries to see whether they felt similarly, which was that United States is 82, not because its freedom is low, but because its freedom is so high that it can yell high enough for everybody to hear about all of the terrible things that happen here. You will not hear people in Chile being able to be free to talk about how terrible it is in Chile or Mongolia. And so United States stands proud at 83 because it is able to, because people here are able to talk to the world about the things that happen here. In fact, it's the most democratic thing to protest. It's the most democratic thing to share the things that should be improved so that this country can strive every day to become a more perfect union. And that's the beauty about America, actually, is that America strives to become better. Whereas I found that in other countries I've been, that okay is okay. And so I'm very happy that even though we're not at the best place, I believe in the America that strives to be better.
Thank you. Snehal, would you comment on that? On your feelings?
Sure. Well, you asked if we think we're American, and so for me, I would say I absolutely think I'm American. I immigrated to the U.S. when I was 5 through the family-based employment preference. And when I started watching the movie, I watched The Donut King on Sunday, and as soon as I started to watch it, and I realized, what Uncle Ted did with helping and sponsoring, family and friends, immediately what came to mind is my own family and my uncle and aunt. And I just want to take this opportunity to share that story because it's so near and dear to me. So we came to the US. There were, I think at the time we came, there were 11 of us together, but in total, my aunt sponsored 16 people, 16 members of her family. And so my uncle, her husband, came to the US on a student visa and went back to India, got married, and my aunt immigrated to the US. This is my mother's sister. And so when my aunt eventually became a US citizen, she sponsored her parents, her siblings, the siblings' husband or spouse, and their children. So in total, there were 16 family members that she sponsored. But what's really remarkable about this story is that in addition to showing the family relationship, a U.S. Sponsor needs to show that they can financially support their relatives that they're sponsoring. So I just find it incredible that my aunt and uncle took on this responsibility to sponsor all of us. They worked really hard, and we're so grateful for that. And in my family, we're very cognizant of that, and we have come a long way. We faced a lot of challenges and struggles, and it's because of their hard work, our parents' hard work, that so many of us are able to be successful in the U.S. But at the same time, I still consider India like going back home. I think I mentioned to you earlier, when I travel back to India, I feel like I'm going home. So I have one foot in each country many times, but that's the way it is. And I'm grateful for that.
I want to follow up on something that all of you brought up, and I want to follow up with Karen Monken about that. So when refugees come here, how do they find work, right? Because even if they were a professional in the old country, they would lack the licensure and so forth here. So how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. We have multiple programs, and it depends on what is available in the local community or what is available through the resettlement agency. So there are some programs through the Department of Health and Human Services. One is called Matching Grant. There's Refugee Social Services. And so in the 90-day program, all that's in many cases able to happen is referral to that employment program. Some people do get employment within 90 days. Sometimes it'll take a little bit longer. But there's assistance coming from these organizations or these programs, but then there's also community members, like in the movie, basically, where somebody knows that they're working in a restaurant and there's a job that's just opened up, and so they bring their friend in and get them this job. If there are multiple people working in a particular place that speak the same language, sometimes employers will hire somebody who is bilingual to communicate with them. I spoke a little bit about Chobani. They have quite a few refugees working for them, and that's sort of how it started, is bringing on more and more people of these same communities. But so there's people working in the programs, there's people in the community, and then there are people like Uncle Ted who started their own businesses and then hire as well. And we actually have seen through the data that refugees actually provide more revenue to the US than it costs to resettle them, not to speak of people in terms of dollars, but not only in the sense that people are starting new businesses and adding value to the community and adding depth to the community, but also paying federal, local, state taxes. And so, the goal really is to get people to be at a level of self-sufficiency as fast as possible so that they can then build on that. But there is definitely some, a little bit of an issue or it's difficult to kind of ladder up sometimes from the initial job that you've gotten to feed your family, to be quite honest. And you mentioned there's people that come over here with degrees that have been doctors overseas, and their medical training is no longer applicable here because they have to go through residency again for them to be able to practice in the United States. So there also are some programs that work with that, with certification and laddering. But it is a little bit difficult to really start where you're at, what level you came from, to be quite honest, because people really just want to make sure that they're feeding their families. They're, we've got this baseline of safety and security, and then they can start, building on that.
My dentist, it's a husband and wife couple, and they're from Peru. And he told me that when they were dentists in Peru, but when they came back here, they had to go back to dental school, do the full program in order to practice here. And of course, they were adults and had expenses and so forth. It's an amazing story. Snehal,
Actually,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
I just wanted to share. I just remembered that, you know, we did a video through our communications team when COVID first started about people who were coming over with medical experience that were able to put it to use volunteering in the community and helping with the COVID response. So I thought that was pretty beautiful that even though they weren't able to practice on a particular level, that they were able to assist.
That is a beautiful story, yeah. Snehal, we have a rather technical question for you. So I don't know if you'll be able to really get into this, but someone asks, if one enters the US under a non-immigrant visa and overstays the limit, is one able to apply for asylum at that point, or is refugee status possible?
So if you're in the US, you're an asylee, and even if you're out of status, you can make the application, but you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of your entry into the US, unless there are some exceptional circumstances. So for example, you're in the US now, you're here for a year, you overstay your visa, and then there's country conditions change back in your home country and you no longer can go back there. So that would be an exceptional circumstance that would allow you to apply for asylum.
Okay, thanks. I hope that answers. I imagine someone knows someone or maybe is themselves in that situation. I hope that helps them. Adam, we have a question for you from the audience. Have the independent donut shops changed to become part of a larger group together and compete with corporate organizations like Dunkin' Donuts, which, as the movie explained, is making a push again in Southern California?
I mean, as far as a lot of the independent owners running donut shops, I mean, we don't get together and talk about what other corporations are doing. We solely just focus on our own business. But I think that speaks for itself. I mean, I think it depends on the community. Some communities like to support small businesses and some communities like the big chain stuff. But I still have a lot of family who runs donut shops. That hasn't changed. I don't think they feel affected by Dunkin' Donuts coming to compete with us. And quite frankly, the love and labor that we put into donuts compared to a lot of these other corporations that come out of machines, you could taste the difference in the quality.
I believe that. Another question for Snehal. Why would an immigrant still be waiting for their green card for more than 8 years?
Because there is the immigration quota system. So what happens is, depending on your, generally this is in the preference classification for family or employment based. And so if you're highly skilled, a researcher, international manager, you're higher up in this preference system for employment based. There's employment based EB1 to EB5. So depending on where you fall in that classification, there are set numbers. And so if if you're in the bottom tier of this employment preference category, it's just going to take you that much longer. So there are 140,000 annual immigrant visas under the employment-based category. And so there's also a 7% cap per country. So that's why certain countries and classifications are oversubscribed. And so that's why it takes a very long time, if you are from China, India, Mexico, for the government to get to your actual case number.
I see. Thank you.
It's the backlog.
We have another question from the audience. In 2021 now, would it be considered illegal to hire only refugees from your own former country, as Ted did, rather than having an open hiring policy available to all? I don't know who could answer that, but if any of you think you can, jump in. I don't think.
I'm not an HR professional, so I don't know. Quite honestly.
Snehal, what do you think?
I mean, I don't practice employment law, but I would say there could be certainly a case against the employer if they're only, that's discrimination. and you can't discriminate. You're hiring, the hiring practices can't discriminate one group over another, so I would say, yes, that potentially could be problematic.
Okay. Adam, someone would like to know if you know how.
Can I
Oh,
answer
sorry,
that
yeah, go ahead.
question?
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think in the best interest of the owner, it's always best not to hire family. I could tell you that. there's a sense of entitlement. They don't come on time. They eat all the profits. It's best to just avoid
Literally,
that.
they eat the profits, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's definitely the voice of experience talking, I think. Yeah. Adam, so someone would like to know if you know how Uncle Ted is doing now.
You know what? I spoke to him during the film, during the production of the film, and that was the first time I've seen him since the downfall of his success. And we caught up, and I think he might have been dealing with some demons during his time of losing everything, right? But when I spoke to him, he sounds like he's with peace. He seems happy. I think he enjoys that he's being recognized for what he's done for a lot of families, and I was super thankful and appreciative of what he's done, and I let it known to him. Yeah.
How old is he now? Do you know? Would you guess?
Maybe in his 70s. Yeah.
Okay. We only have a couple of minutes more, and I'd like to ask one last question to Ayda. Could you tell us a little bit about this project you work on, the Storytellers Collective?
Yeah, absolutely. The Storytellers Collective groups together refugees across the country from different countries, and it encourages refugees to go and share their story and their experience so that people can hear and meet a refugee if they haven't yet, and hear what they've had to go through to come here. And much like what the stories that were shared here today, the purpose is really to talk about the humanity that we all share together. And so we have people from across the world as members of the Storytellers Collective. And if you are a refugee and would like to join it, you should go to Refugee International, and there'll be a link that you can click there.
And if anyone watching wants to, tell their story on that, you can contact the Teaneck Film Festival. It'll get to me, and we'll pass it on to you, Ayda.
Yeah, of course. If you don't mind me jumping in to say too, David, a lot of people feel like they have to have kind of a quote unquote extraordinary story in order to share their experience. Looking at the film, one of the things that it reminded me of is, Uncle Ted was in survival mode until he reached 20 million, and then he broke down. And I think it's one of those things where, one of the things we forget is being a refugee is a really traumatic experience. And so seeing him go through that pain is not unusual. But I think what I want to say is he's as important as he was when he made 20 million and also when he faced his demons. I think the ultimate freedom really is to live in America and just be ordinary and not having to be special and not having to be an employer with 20 different people under you. It's just being an ordinary person living an ordinary life, free and safe, making living wage. Sometimes that's okay as well. And so if you are that person, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and connect in this amazing group of people. As there's very few refugees on this whole planet. And so you'll find a great community there.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us tonight. This has been a terrific discussion. We've had very enlightening and informative, but perhaps more importantly, really, I come away with a great feeling of warmth hearing these stories. I really thank you. And at this time, I would like to introduce the executive director of the Teaneck International Film Festival, Jeremy Lentz, who is here in purple glory and has a few words for us. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction. I just want to personally thank all of our panelists tonight for this incredible talk back. You know, there's so much that goes on in our world, and, you know, we tend to hear so much of the negative that's reported in the news. And to see each of you doing such great work to impact change in our communities and positive change, which is the theme of our festival, Activism Making Change. You know, to be able to share these stories and to lift each other up and to provide hope, you know, it's just incredible. And that's why we here at the Teaneck Film Festival continue to do the work that we do, because we get to meet people like you and have these experiences. And just to say, you know, in the last year that we've been able to work with PBS and Independent Lentz and to present these kind of films and to stay together virtually has been so impactful to keep us in touch and to keep the morale up and mental health and all those kinds of things. So, you know, I want to thank you, because tonight we're closing our spring series and we're pivoting now towards our film festival, which will take place November 11th through the 21st, which will be a hybrid festival where we're going to return to our in-person venues where we can hug again and meet in person and share these stories, but we'll also continue with this virtual platform because the feedback has been so positive. And I want to remind all the viewers that are out there that are watching this tonight, TIFF is a nonprofit. We're supported by the Puffin Foundation, our co-presenting partner here. So we ask that you consider donating. There is a donate button at the top of the screen. So if you haven't made a contribution, or even if you had and you feel generous and you want to make another one, the funds go a long, long way to ensure that we keep telling these great stories and connecting to these great people. And hopefully that ripple effect will get back out there in our communities, not only here in Teaneck, but throughout the nation and hopefully globally. So I want to thank you all. Thank you to our organizing committee. And we look forward to seeing you all back here on November 11th for what will be our 16th anniversary, our 16th consecutive anniversary. And I hope to see you all in person so we can give each other a big hug. So thank you all. God bless. Good night. And we'll see you soon.
Okay. Jeremy, Karen says we're done.
Great.
All right.